Okay, so we're talking about pump testing. And what is the purpose of a pump test? Well, it's really just to make sure that your pump is working correctly. Well, how do you know if it's correct or not? There's some standards you're supposed to meet, but those standards are based on the pump itself. And this pump happens to be a Darley, so we're not entirely certain what is in there. The standards, Darley built a lot of pump heads and they were a little bit different. They all vary a little bit. So really you'd have to come up with the specifics for each individual pump to compare them to anything. But that's kind of what you're supposed to do. You do an annual pump test. We're required to do so. It's written in the Red Book that we're required to do an annual pump test. It does not define what that pump test looks like. It just says we're supposed to do one. And it says to make sure that the pump is operating at appropriate pressures and volumes or something like that. So it's pretty open-ended. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do a pump test. So NFPA has a standard, and NFPA doesn't really apply completely to what we do. They have a different world, and we need to pump big, long hose lays with low volume, and they pump short hose lays with high volume in general. However, a lot of the concepts are really similar, and a lot of things can carry over. So, yes, the best thing to do with a pump test is to compare it to existing numbers you have for the truck. So every time I get a new engine, I do a pump test immediately on it. Even though it comes with a performance sheet that says it can do this, that was done somewhere else. It was done at some specific standard established in the contract, which may or may not be realistic to what we're doing. So I think our Type 6s came, they had pump tests done with 20 feet at 2.5 inch suction, 20 feet at 3 inch suction, which is going to be different than what we're actually using out there. So I usually do my pump test just direct out of the tank, mostly because it's easy. It's about the best performance I can get out of it because I'm getting at least some pressurized water into the system, so it's going to run at the highest amount. And yeah, it's clean and simple. That's the main thing. And then I'll just compare that every time I do it. So you're supposed to do it at least once a year, and you're supposed to do it after any significant maintenance or something was done on it. A couple weeks ago, I replaced a pump head for a BLM truck. Really, we should be doing a pump test on that afterwards to make sure that it's actually still performing at what it's supposed to perform at. Establish a new functional line. That was a good question. Wasn't even a crazy one. What else you got?
What could cause a pump to start losing pressure?
Cavitation, damage due to cavitation, damage due to other wear in the impellers. On a pump like this, the drive shaft coming in has it's got a 3-cylinder diesel motor, and they kind of bang and rattle a little bit. They're not balanced very well. So if they're run at low RPMs, they commonly will have an impact on that drive shaft. It'll kind of slap, for lack of a better term. And there's a system designed to absorb that, and it sort of works, but a lot of them don't work quite right. And that'll have an impact on performance. All of a sudden the pump won't be able to spin. It doesn't have as much horsepower behind it as it should have. So that can be a good indicator that you have a problem going wrong and you need to repair it. Getting a plastic bag stuck in it, that's a common one. Anything like that. Rocks. And it could actually be something wrong with the rest of the system. The suction side of the whole system could have some sort of obstruction. Heck, even the discharge side could have something wrong with it, and then a flow test, a pump test would actually give you some information about that. Anything else before we start? 'Cause I'm going to do this off the top of my head, so hopefully I can hit it somewhat correct. So, like NFPA 1911, I think there's 5 tests to go with it. You do a dry vacuum test, which I've done several of, and I already shot some video on it, so I'm not too worried about it. You do a dry vacuum test, and you can check the other videos if you want to see how to do that. It's pretty easy. You do a primer test, make sure that you can pull a prime within 30 seconds. And then there's 3 flow tests, and they're at like 100% capacity, and then at 75% capacity, and at 50% capacity, I think. That's what they are. I could be wrong on this. But really that capacity is volume, and then that capacity has to match a certain pressure. That's not really what we're doing. We're not doing high volume. We do high pressure and low volume most of the time. We need to pump a hose lay that goes all the way to the ridge over there. So I need to produce more pressure and ensure that I can still produce volume. So when you went to like an S211, or the last time you taught an S211, hopefully they talked about pump performance, or you talked about it because you were probably the instructor. Maybe? No? All right. Everybody's been to 211? No?
It's only been about 17 years.
Yeah.
Okay, 17 years ago we did an even poorer job than we do today.
All right.
But the concept is, I look at this, equation, and I say, well, I need 284 psi to pump this hose lay, because that's what the hose lay is going to demand for pressure. And I also need 30 gallons a minute. The question then becomes, can my pump produce 283 psi on 30 gallons a minute? Well, this pump test will give you a chart that'll tell you if it will or not. And that's the extra usefulness of this, because there's a whole bunch of ways to do pump tests. You can do single point tests. You can put a flow meter on there and make sure that you can move whatever the maximum capacity is. This one takes a whole bunch of different points, at least 4, and you can put that on a chart, and then you have a performance chart, and you know what your pump's capable of doing. If you need 200 psi to pump this hose lay, you'll know that you have 60 gallons a minute available to you. If you need 60 gallons a minute, you'll know that you can build up to about 200 psi. That's just a rough guess.
So there's a whole way to calculate how much pressure is lost in each length of hose and each piece of brass that water has to go through. And then there's a big slide ruler that you can use to calculate how much pressure and volume it would take to push that hose. There it is.
And we're going to use this today. So, and we don't do accessories anymore,
Okay.
since it's been 17 years.
Right.
Because 17 years ago we used to add 5 psi per accessory. Yeah, we don't do that anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. So, what we're going to do, we want to move the maximum amount of water we can move. And a pump, commonly we think of a pump as when I turn up the RPM, I get more pressure. But really what I do is when I turn it up, it spins more, and it spins faster, and it moves more water. And if I don't change the restriction on the water moving, my pressure goes up. So I get pressure because I've restricted that flow. And there's a mathematical equation that you can figure out what you're flowing at any given pressure. So the key is to be moving the maximum amount of volume possible. And you do that by moving the maximum number of RPMs possible. So I crank this thing up as far as it'll go. The great thing about all our engines, they're all mechanically governed out. It may or may not be at the maximum of what the pump can actually do or what the motor can actually do, but you can't overspeed them. Now, that being said, I've never worked on or with a Montana Metalworks
Yeah, it's about to ask
truck.
you. Do you know the...
So we'll see what happens. We'll turn it up. We won't blow it up. I'm sure of that. Because still, it's there. I mean, we should be able to see it. And if you really have no idea and you're not confident in the fact that it is limited out, watch the tack, pull out the book. There's a tack on this, right? You're not seeing it.
It's right above the store.
Yeah, it's a little.
It's not much of a tech.
Oh, right there. There it is. Okay, got it now. And sometimes the tacks aren't correct either. It's
Right.
something we found a lot. So watch the tack. Be cautious. Remember, it's a diesel motor. They don't like to do more than about 4,000 RPMs. So if you're getting upwards of 4,000 RPMs, you're probably getting pretty close. If you look at the book for the truck, it should give you a maximum RPM somewhere in there, as high as it can go. or it should give you a shutoff pressure, which you can use as a guide to get you to a starting point. The shutoff pressure would be the maximum pressure that the pump can build, moving no water. So we'll crank it up to its maximum RPM, and we'll start flowing water. Usually I use that guy. It's an adjustable nozzle. It has settings for 30, 60, 95, and 125 gallons a minute. So we'll flow water out of that, and we'll read the residual pressure on the gauge here. And because this nozzle is rated at 100 psi, and the pressure will be above 100 psi, we put those numbers into the friction loss calculator. Actually, we use the nozzle bore discharge calculator portion of it, and you can calculate exactly how much it is flowing. The only hang up with that is, does everybody have one of these?
No.
What do you mean? Why not? It's only $800.
Right?
It's a cheap investment, right?
$8.
Yeah. Therein lies the problem. So, the conversation has come up before, and we're going to do it with this one too. Just because we can get more numbers, we can get a broader performance chart out of it. But the other way to do it is you can build a nozzle tree. So 3/8 tips. They're 3/8 because 30 gallons a minute seems like as low as I'd really want to go. If I wanted a little more, data in my chart, in my performance chart, I'd probably go with a couple smaller tips too, and maybe we'll throw those in there just to get a broader chart. But for a general pump test, I'd go 3/8 tips. You go 4 of them, you put 3 wyes together. It's pretty simple. And we'll open them one at a time, and we'll flow water out of them. And then we can calculate what we're actually flowing at maximum RPM. Okay, good enough. Okay, so how do you do the test? Got that maximum RPM piece. You have to attach this guy to the truck. I usually use my primary discharge. You could use your fresh water because it's actually closer to the pump head and should get just a minuscule tiny, not really very much at all, better performance. But I actually like to run it off my primary because that's the one I use all the time. I'm going to mount this guy directly to it. I went upside down thinking that it wouldn't spread it around as much. I know I'm not sure how I'm going to keep the big socket wet. Maybe like that. Okay, now we got a document. You have to remember the document. Okay, so I got 3/8 tips. I have 4 of them. What's a 3/8 tip rated at?
30 gallons a minute.
30 gallons a minute at what pressure?
Don't know.
Anybody? 50 psi.
Yeah.
Okay, so at 50, I have one at 30 gallons a minute. And then I put another one in, and it's not that I have 2 3/8 tips. At this point, I'm looking at flow. So 2 of them open is 60 gallons a minute. Three of them is going to be 90, and 4 of them is going to be 120. That makes sense? Okay. Those are settings. They're not tips. So when we go to put them in the friction loss calculator that I hid for myself, there it is, we'll actually have to input that data into this and then read it off that. But we'll get to that part in a minute. So what we want to do, somebody's got to be my scribe.
Oh, you wrote that in?
Are you kidding? I wrote the first part. Right? We'll type it up later for the official document. But what we're going to do, we're fired up. We're going to start opening valves. and you're going to read and write down the residual pressure that's in here. So first we'll spool it all the way up until it doesn't go up any higher, and you'll write down shut off. Okay, so just put it off to the side because I didn't really leave a spot for shut off pressure. And then I'll open up the first one, and next to 30, you'll write down whatever the residual pressure is. And then we'll open the second one, and at 60, you'll write down whatever the residual pressure is. And we will use that data to calculate the volume that we had at those pressures. I have a feeling we're going to get wet. Probably me.
Or blow your tripod over is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, that's going to move over here in a minute, and somebody's going to monitor it. So yeah, that's all we got. We got a full tank of water. We're going to use most of it. This is direct off the pump. Yep. So nothing. The only thing that has to get opened is this guy. Good test. See, we really got wet. Okay. We'll fire it up and we'll run our test.
Right, exactly.
If this thing's gonna get wet, move it for me. But try and keep it in frame so we're actually still recording. And the little red dot means we're recording. And that's interesting. My apparatus may not be here.
Gated Y might not be.
Concepts still sound. Low oil pressure. Fun. So we let it warm up for a bit, and we noticed that the pressure wouldn't come up right. The pump to tank was open. You don't actually have to use the number 2 as a pump to tank if you use this guy, your number 16 bypass. This will allow enough water to cool that pump. Now, it's a much bigger valve, and you can regulate pressure with it. So it's actually quite useful to use it so you can get your RPMs up so that 3-cylinder diesel isn't rattling all over the place. You can get your RPMs up and then you can regulate your pressure with it. That's why I would use it. I wouldn't in general just leave it on to recirculate water. That's built into the system. So trust the system, it actually does work. You only need to move like 3 to 12 gallons a minute to keep your pump cool. So, okay, so we got numbers. We measured. We burned almost a half a tank of water in what, less than a minute probably?
Yeah.
That was fun. We'll get with that later. Now we need to calculate what those numbers mean. This is the part that, well, if you've never used one of these, it'll probably be more confusing than not. Or maybe not. Maybe it'll be easier that way. Okay, so I'm gonna need that pen before we even get to that. So, here, let me do this. Hopefully you can read that. Our numbers, we have one line that says at 50 PSI, I got 30, 60, 90, and 120. We got a shutoff pressure of 400. That's the top of our curve. Moving 0 gallons per minute, we can get 400 PSI. And then we got residual pressures running down. So we'll make another mark here for volume. Volume will be out on the end. Go ahead and hold on to that. The way that this guy works is you don't use the side with the black that says metric, because that's what the Australians use. Or everyone else in the world outside of us. So you use the green side, the English side, which I'm pretty sure that English, never mind. The way this works is there's two calculators. There's a nozzle discharge calculator, there's a friction loss calculator. We're not using friction loss, we're not measuring friction loss at the moment. What we're doing is we're working with the nozzle discharge. So our tips are rated at what? 50. So I'm going to set the top of the calculator to 50. For the camera, take a look. See, there's a little arrow up there, right? Okay, at 50, I go to my 3/8 tip, and it says 30 gallons a minute. Cool. Okay, the rest of these I actually have to put a mark in there to denote where they're at. So then I had 60, and then I had 90, and then I had 110, 20. Just above 34, or 3/4 of an inch. That'll be important later because we actually have pre-existing pump data off the previous test, and I remember at least a 3/4 inch in there. So we can, our highest volume measurement, we should be able to compare to that 3/4 inch piece. Okay, so I have 4 marks in there, and then we go to this guy. You can go ahead and take that pen. So, when I was at 30 gallons a minute, how much pressure did I have?
240.
240. So I set the top arrow to 240. Okay, that's the pressure that we actually had. 220, 40, 60, 80, yeah. That's perfect. 240. And when I look at my 3/8 mark, my 30 gallon a minute piece, we were moving 60 to 4, say 65. Graduations change between them, so you have to kind of adjust, and it's an estimate. We could do it with the basic math, but really, we're using a bunch of gated wyes stuck together. It's an estimate. We're close enough. So it's 65. So you're gonna put 65 exactly where you put it there, next to that. So it's running across. And then we go to the next one. At the 60 gallon a minute setting, what was your pressure?
175.
60, 70. Oh, my eyes, I'm getting old. 175, close enough. And I'm looking at 110 gallons a minute. Okay, reading that second mark, I'm looking at about 110. Okay, and then on the third one, which was the 90 gallon a minute setting,
132.
132. Oh, wow. 130 and a tiny little bit. And we were doing 145 gallons per minute. God, did I do this right? Yeah. Okay, and on the last one, we're at, what, 90?
88.
88. 88-ish. Doing about 155. Okay. So we're done with this. We're done with the calculation. At this point, I'm going to wipe off those marks because I'm going to mark it somewhere else later. And so the first piece we had here were the settings, and that's all they were, is settings. Those mean nothing now. They were just an index to get us to these numbers. These numbers are a pump chart. So if I need 65 gallons a minute, this pump will give me 240 psi and still deliver me 65 gallons a minute. If I need 155 gallons per minute, I have issues because I can't really get that through my hose. But if you needed 155 gallons a minute, the pump will still produce you 88 psi. Okay, that's really good. That is better than I expected, which actually makes me question whether or not the step and everything on the nozzle is truly functional. But we'll play with that part later and truth whether or not it really works. Nonetheless, you still have a pump chart that works to compare to in the future. And you can look for loss in performance. So you have a pump test. Ooh, she's even got it out. At a 3/4 inch tip, which is pretty close to our 120 gallon a minute setting, what did it say for performance?
116 gallons per minute at 152 psi.
152 psi out of a 3. Wow, we did not get that. Now, there could be things like elevation. How long ago was that done? Was that this spring?
228 of 18.
Oh, okay, so yeah, it wasn't that long ago. I actually questioned the numbers off of this based on the apparatus that we're trying to use. That's what I think might be faulty. But 60 gallons a minute. It says it was getting 200 psi, and we got 240 psi at 65 gallons a minute. So our test is showing it performing above this. Now, here's the problem with this pump test. The only problem I have with this pump test is we don't actually know how it was tested or to what standard it was tested to. So a 3/4 inch tip is rated at, if they're looking at this more from a like NFPA type standpoint, they could have been looking at getting to a volume or a pressure and moving enough volume to consider it a pass. So I put a 3/4 inch tip on there, and that's roughly 120 gallon a minute setting, and they could get it up to 152 psi. That means that they got enough out of it to consider it a pass, which I think is how they did it, because I'm also looking at 2 1/2 inch tip measurements, and the 1/2 inch tips are at different RPMs and therefore different volumes. So at 200 psi they could get 60 gallons a minute out of it, and that works. But this isn't measuring the maximum it can do. This is measuring whether or not it can pass the test and meet the minimums, which are really being able to meet the minimums, not necessarily defined by NFPA 1911, but sort of kind of in that direction. Nothing wrong with this pump test whatsoever, as long as you're doing it exactly the same when you test it. And when you take it back there every year, I assume it goes back there every year. Don't know.
It's not ours though, it's not our engine.
I love it. Assuming that it gets taken back there every year, they're going to do the test the same and compare the numbers that way. You can come up with these numbers on your own, and even though I really think that the lowest number there is a little bit dicey, and we'll do the other pump test to check. But now these are in your pocket. You got them with you. You have a pump performance performance chart that you can use for that truck, and you can compare those numbers to future numbers when you test the truck. So I have records on all of our engines here, and we just do it every year ourselves, and it works just fine. Cool.
Like it.
Any questions? It makes sense?
Yeah.
All right, let's validate.
Big nozzle.
Big nozzle.
Little nozzle.
Okay. Cool. Now, here's the funny thing is, the numbers don't come out the same. You can't just look at it and go, oh yeah, no, you gotta calculate it first. Because it is based at a different setting. So, that nozzle's rated at 100 PSI, not 50. So then I have to go in and I have to put my marks in. 30, 60, 90, 125, and then you can run this guy, right? Okay, so 30 gallon a minute setting, which is the first mark, 270 PSI. So this arrow needs to say 270 PSI. Now you're way over 800. Top graduation. See the
I was
arrow?
looking down here.
Yeah, I know. The arrow points to it. So there's
Okay.
200, maybe 280. So you got to split the difference between those marks.
Right there.
Yeah, a little more. Yeah, good enough. That'll work. And then you look at the bottom mark and you read the volume.
We're at about 49.
49. So at 270, see, they don't match up perfectly. At 270, we can do 49. Okay, that's actually on mark for where we were. Now go to 190 PSI on the top arrow.
Okay.
Okay, and the second mark I made
Is at 80.
first mark is a 2.
So 82.5.
82. 82 or 83.
Okay.
Right in there. 190, we're doing 82. We're still on mark for the first numbers. 95, so 145.
Line is at 15.
And 103. 10 a smidge.
Yep.
120. It says?
25.
Yeah, 125. Well, is that 125 or is that 130? It's 125. Well, it should be because it's rated at 100. 103 PSI over.
Yeah.
So it's actually pretty close.
I'm recording you.
Are you recording me?
I was.
Sweet. Right on.
When you had the big nozzle running, I started it for you.
Good deal. I have a whole bunch of video with the big nozzle running, but nonetheless, we've just validated our numbers. I mean, if we went and actually charted these out, which I think would be a good thing, it gives you 8 points to measure from, which is nice to have, but probably more importantly, it validates that the first numbers are pretty darn close, or at least within the curve, give or take a little bit, and it tells me that using that other apparatus, it does work, which is nice because the other thing you can do is change those 3/8 tips to 1/4 inch tips,
Right.
or 3/16 tips, and you have a different volume measurement. So you can get even more points,
Right.
and more importantly, you can get more points at high pressure, low volume, which is where we have a tendency to do most of our operating. We're not moving 125 or 145 or 150 gallons a minute very often. We're
Our
usually,
tank wouldn't last very long.
well, if you were plugged into a source or
Yeah,
something.
right.
But the other thing is, 1.5 hose is only going to carry 100 gallons a minute at the most, more than a couple hundred feet. Otherwise, your friction loss, it just doesn't, you can't cram that much water into that size of hose. So having pumps in general that do that much volume is kind of useless, but measuring them that way is only good for pump performance. When you're looking at and having a chart that tells you what it can do, you're much better off having those numbers in the lower, high pressure, low